The sound of butter gently simmering filled the space, soft but commanding, as Emily Carter adjusted the pan with a subtle tilt of her wrist, allowing the liquid to coat the halibut evenly, her movements deliberate, unhurried, and entirely precise. And what began as curiosity in the kitchen had now turned into something closer to tension, because this was no longer amusing. This was no longer a simple mistake waiting to happen. This was control, and control at this level did not come from guesswork. Chef Daniel Brooks shifted his stance slightly, unfolding his arms without realizing it, his eyes fixed on every motion she made, searching for hesitation, for error, for anything that would restore the balance he had assumed was his. But there was none. Emily reached for the saffron threads next, not grabbing them blindly, but selecting them with care, as if she understood exactly how much was needed without measuring, her fingers moving with the quiet confidence of someone who had done this not once, not twice, but countless times before. The line cooks began to slow their work even further, one of them forgetting to plate a dish until another nudged him gently, reminding him that service had not stopped just because something unusual was unfolding. Yet the pull of the moment was undeniable. Even the dining room seemed to sense it. Conversations lowered, heads subtly turned toward the glass that separated them from the kitchen, drawn by the unspoken shift in energy. Emily's focus never wavered. She adjusted the heat again, lowering it just slightly, her timing exact, her awareness complete, and when she began preparing the citrus foam, her technique revealed something even more telling, the kind of refinement that could not be learned casually, the kind that required discipline, training, and years of repetition. Brooks stepped closer now, not out of authority, but out of necessity, as if proximity might give him answers that distance could not. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quieter than before, stripped of its earlier edge. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. And for the first time since the challenge began, Emily glanced at him, not with defiance, not with pride, but with a calm that carried something deeper, something grounded. "I have had some experience," she replied simply, and then returned to her work, leaving the answer hanging in the air, incomplete, but somehow more revealing because of it. The halibut was lifted from the pan at exactly the right moment, not a second too soon, not a second too late. Its surface perfectly opaque yet delicate, the kind of balance that separated good cooking from exceptional execution. She plated the dish with the same quiet precision, each element placed with intention, not for decoration but for harmony. And as the final touch settled into place, the kitchen had gone completely silent. No clatter, no commands, no movement, just the soft hum of equipment and the weight of realization beginning to settle over everyone present. Brooks stared at the plate, his mind working quickly, analyzing, comparing, searching for flaws. But what he saw instead was something unsettling, something that did not align with his expectations, because this was not imitation, this was not luck, this was mastery, and mastery was not something that could be faked under pressure. One of the senior cooks leaned in slightly, his voice barely audible. "Chef," he murmured, "that plating, it is not just correct, it is better." Brooks did not respond. He could not, because the truth of that statement had already reached him, settling in with a weight he could not ignore. And beyond the glass, a few diners had stood from their seats, trying to catch a better glimpse of what was happening inside, drawn by something they could not explain but instinctively recognized as important. Emily stepped back from the counter, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her posture relaxed, as if she had simply completed a routine task, not a performance under scrutiny. And in that stillness, the power in the room shifted again, more noticeably this time, because the question was no longer whether she would fail, but how it was possible that she had not. And Chef Daniel Brooks, for the first time in a very long time, found himself without immediate answers, standing in a silence that no longer belonged to him. Chef Daniel Brooks reached forward slowly, lifting the plate with both hands as if its weight had suddenly increased, his eyes scanning every detail again, searching for something to challenge, something to question. But the longer he looked, the clearer it became that there was nothing to correct, nothing to dismiss. The balance of color, the precision of placement, the subtle layering of aroma rising from the dish. It all spoke a language he knew too well, and that was exactly what unsettled Him, because this was not just competence, this was intention, and intention at this level did not happen by accident. The kitchen remained still as he brought the fork up, cutting into the halibut with a gentle pressure that revealed its perfect texture, flakes separating cleanly, moisture preserved, exactly as it should be. He tasted it, and for a moment, his expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted, something small but undeniable, the kind of shift that only those closest to him would ever notice. And one of the sous chefs did notice, his posture straightening slightly, as if bracing for a reaction that did not come. Brooks lowered the fork slowly, placing it back on the plate with care. His voice, when it finally returned, was quieter than anyone in that room had ever heard it during service. "Who taught you that technique?" he asked again. But this time the question carried weight, not mockery. Emily met his gaze without hesitation, her expression calm, steady. "No one taught me," she said softly. "I learned over time." And the simplicity of her answer only deepened the silence, because it offered no explanation, no easy category to place her in. The diners beyond the glass were now openly watching, a few standing closer, their conversations forgotten entirely, drawn into a moment that felt larger than a simple dinner service. One of them, an older man seated near the front, leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied Emily more closely, as if trying to recall something just beyond his memory. Brooks set the plate down carefully, his fingers lingering for a fraction of a second, longer than necessary. Then he stepped back, creating a small distance between himself and her, a subtle shift that spoke volumes. Because for the first time, he was no longer controlling the moment, he was reacting to it. "Make another," he said suddenly, his voice regaining some of its firmness but lacking the earlier edge. "Same dish, but adjust the acidity in the reduction." It was a test, not of skill, but of consistency, because even talented cooks could succeed once, but repeating perfection under pressure was something else entirely. The staff exchanged glances again, the tension rising in a different way now, no longer amusement, no longer disbelief, but anticipation. Emily nodded once, already turning back to the station, her hands moving with the same steady rhythm. No sign of frustration, no sign of urgency, as if the request had been expected all along. She began again, not rushing, not overthinking, simply working, and as she adjusted the saffron reduction, she did something subtle, something small, altering the balance with a touch so precise it would have gone unnoticed by most, but not by Brooks. His eyes sharpened as he observed, because that adjustment was not random, it was intentional, corrective, the kind of change someone made when they understood not just the recipe, but the purpose behind it. Minutes passed, though they felt longer, and once again, the dish came together with quiet perfection. Emily plated it, this time with a slight variation, not dramatic, but enough to show awareness, creativity, control. She stepped back, the second plate resting beside the first, and the kitchen seemed to hold its breath again. Brooks approached slowly, picking up the fork once more, tasting, analyzing, and this time, the reaction was immediate, not visible to the untrained eye, but unmistakable to those who knew him. A stillness, a pause that stretched just long enough to confirm what he had been resisting, and somewhere in the dining room, the older man suddenly stood, his chair scraping softly against the floor as realization reached him all at once, his voice cutting through the silence with quiet certainty. "That is impossible," he said, not loudly, but clearly enough for the nearest tables to hear, and as heads turned toward him, he took a step closer to the glass, his gaze fixed on Emily. "Unless," he began, the word hanging in the air like the beginning of something no one was prepared for, and in that moment, the entire room leaned into the silence, waiting for what came next. The word lingered in the air, unfinished yet heavy with implication, and the older man took another step closer to the glass, his eyes narrowing with a recognition that felt both sudden and undeniable. While inside the kitchen, Chef Daniel Brooks slowly lowered the fork, his gaze shifting from the plate to Emily Carter, no longer measuring her as a curiosity, but studying her as a possibility he had not yet allowed himself to accept. "Unless what?" Brooks asked, his voice steady but quieter now, the edge replaced by something more cautious. The man outside did not answer immediately, as if choosing his words carefully. Then he spoke again. unless she is not who you think she is. And the statement moved through the room like a quiet ripple, subtle but powerful, drawing attention from every corner of the dining area. The staff in the kitchen exchanged uncertain glances, because something was changing, something that no longer felt like a simple challenge or an evening's entertainment. Emily remained still, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her expression unchanged, calm in a way that no longer seemed passive, but deliberate. Brooks took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them, his eyes searching her face now, not for weakness, but for truth. "Your name," he said, and this time it was not a demand, it was a question that carried weight. Emily held his gaze, her voice soft but clear. "Emily Carter," she replied, and for a brief moment, nothing happened, as if the name itself needed time to settle into the room, to find its place among the expectations that had already been built. Then the older man outside let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, though there was no humor in it, only disbelief. "That is not possible," he murmured, shaking his head slightly, but his eyes never left her. "Emily Carter disappeared 5 years ago," he continued, his voice gaining strength as others around him began to listen more closely. 3 Michelin stars, San Francisco, one of the most respected chefs in the country. A murmur spread through the diners, low and uncertain. As fragments of recognition began to connect, Brooks' expression shifted again, the pieces aligning in his mind, memories of articles, of industry conversations, of a name that had once carried significant weight and then vanished. Without explanation, he looked back at Emily, really looked this time, beyond the simple coat, beyond the quiet presence, searching for the person behind the image he had dismissed. "Why are you here?" he asked, and the question came out softer than he intended, stripped of authority, stripped of assumption. Emily glanced briefly toward the dining room, her eyes passing over the faces now watching her with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief, before returning to him. "I came for dinner," she said simply, and the answer, so ordinary, so unembellished, seemed to carry more meaning than anything more elaborate could have, because it revealed what he had failed to see from the beginning, that she had not come to prove anything, not to challenge, not to impress, just to exist in a space where she had been judged before she had spoken a single word. The silence that followed was deeper than before, heavier. As the reality of the moment settled over everyone present, Brooks straightened slightly, his posture adjusting as if responding to an unspoken realization, the balance of power no longer where he had assumed it to be. "You should have said something," he began, though even as he spoke, the words felt insufficient. Emily's gaze remained steady. "Would it have changed anything?" she asked quietly, and that question, simple and direct, cut through the room more sharply than any accusation could have. Because the answer was already clear, Brooks did not respond. He could not. Because in that moment, he understood, not just who she was, but what had just happened. The assumptions, the challenge, the spectacle, all built on a judgment that had nothing to do with skill and everything to do with appearance. The older man outside stepped back slightly, his earlier certainty now replaced with a quiet respect, and one by one, the diners began to settle into a different kind of silence, no longer expectant, no longer entertained, but reflective, as if they had all witnessed something they had not intended to see. Emily untied the apron slowly, placing it neatly on the counter, her movements calm, composed, unchanged by the shift around her. And as she turned slightly, preparing to step away from the kitchen, no one moved to stop her, no one spoke, because the moment no longer belonged to anyone but her, and the lesson, though unspoken, had already been delivered with a clarity that no words could match, leaving behind a room that understood, perhaps too late, exactly what it had just overlooked. For several long seconds, no one spoke, and the silence carried a different weight now, no longer built on expectation or judgment, but on realization, the kind that settles slowly and leaves no room for denial. Emily Carter stepped away from the counter with the same quiet composure she had shown from the beginning, her hands free, her posture relaxed, as if nothing extraordinary had taken place. Yet every eye in the room followed her, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of something closer. To respect, something earned without a single demand for recognition. Chef Daniel Brooks remained where he stood, his gaze fixed on the space she had just occupied, his mind replaying every moment with a clarity that was almost uncomfortable. The tone he had used, the assumptions he had made, the confidence with which he had believed he understood the situation, and now, standing in the aftermath of it, he felt the shift not just in the room, but within himself, a quiet dismantling of certainty. That did not happen often. He took a slow breath, then turned slightly, addressing the kitchen for the first time since the revelation. "Resume service," he said, but his voice lacked its usual sharpness, replaced instead by something more measured, more controlled. The staff moved quickly, almost too quickly, eager to break the stillness, to return to something familiar. But even as the clatter of pans and low voices returned, the atmosphere had changed, something unspoken lingering in every movement. Emily reached for her coat, lifting it from the back of the chair with a simple motion, and as she slipped it on, one of the younger servers hesitated nearby, as if wanting to say something but unsure how. She offered a small, respectful nod instead, and Emily returned it just as simply. No acknowledgement of status, no shift in demeanor, just quiet understanding. Across the room, the older man who had recognized her remained standing, his expression thoughtful, almost reflective, as if he had witnessed something rare and was still processing its meaning. He did not approach her, did not interrupt, because there was a sense, shared by many in that room, that this moment did not belong to anyone else. As Emily turned toward the exit, her path clear, the usual noise of the restaurant softened again, conversations resuming but quieter, more restrained, and just before she reached the door, a voice called out, not loudly, but enough to stop her, "Ms. Carter." It was Brooks, his tone different now, stripped of the authority that had defined it earlier, carrying instead a sincerity that felt unfamiliar even to him. She paused, turning slightly, her expression calm. Waiting, he stepped forward, not fully closing the distance, but enough to be heard without raising his voice. "I misjudged you," he said, the words direct, without embellishment, and for a moment, it seemed as though the entire room leaned in again, not for spectacle, but for something quieter, more human. Emily regarded him for a brief second, her gaze steady. Then she spoke, her voice soft but clear. "You did not know me," she said, and the distinction, subtle but important, settled between them, because it was not an accusation, not even a correction, but a statement of fact, one that carried more weight than any apology could immediately resolve. Brooks nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging something deeper than the moment itself, and for the first time that evening, there was no attempt to reclaim control, no effort to reshape the narrative, only acceptance. Emily offered a small nod in return, then turned and continued toward the door, her steps measured, unhurried, the world beyond the glass waiting just as it had before she entered, unchanged by what had happened inside. And as the door closed softly behind her, the restaurant remained standing, its elegance intact, its reputation untouched, but something within it had shifted, something that could not be undone. Because in the span of a single evening, a room full of people had been reminded, without force, without spectacle, that true mastery does not announce itself, and that the quietest presence in the room may carry the greatest weight, leaving behind a silence that lingered long after she was gone, not empty, but full of understanding. The door had barely settled back into place when the quiet it left behind began to echo louder than any noise that had filled the restaurant before, not because the room was empty, but because something fundamental had shifted in the way everyone inside now saw it. Chef Daniel Brooks remained standing where he was for a moment longer, his eyes fixed on the entrance, as if expecting her to return, though he knew she would not, and that realization carried a weight he could not easily dismiss. He turned back toward the kitchen slowly, the familiar layout now feeling slightly unfamiliar, as if the space itself had been altered by what had just occurred. The line cooks resumed their rhythm, but their movements were more deliberate now, more aware, as if each action carried a new level of scrutiny, not from him, but from themselves. One of the sous chefs approached cautiously, lowering his voice. "Chef, the next seating is ready," he said, and Brooks nodded, though his focus seemed elsewhere for a brief second before he forced it back to the present. "Send them in," he replied, his tone steady but quieter, and as the next wave of guests entered, the restaurant returned to its polished routine, servers moving gracefully, dishes leaving the kitchen with precision, yet beneath the surface, there was a subtle change. Conversations among the diners carried a different tone, softer, more reflective, as if the evening had offered something unexpected, something that lingered beyond the menu. Near the front, the older man who had recognized Emily Carter remained seated now, his posture relaxed but his expression thoughtful. He lifted his glass slowly, taking a measured sip, his gaze drifting toward the kitchen again, not with curiosity, but with a quiet respect for what had unfolded. Inside, Brooks moved through the stations, checking plates, adjusting details. But his usual sharp corrections were absent, replaced instead by a watchful silence. And when he reached the halibut station, he paused, his eyes resting briefly on the ingredients laid out before him. The butter, the saffron, the citrus, all the same as they had been earlier, yet somehow different, because now they carried the memory of how they had been handled, of the precision he had witnessed, of the control that had not belonged to him in that moment. He picked up a knife, testing its balance in his hand, then set it back down gently, a small action that spoke volumes to those who noticed. The younger cooks exchanged glances again, unsure of what to make of the shift, because this was not the chef Brooks they were used to. This was someone recalibrating, someone reconsidering, and that was not something they had seen before. As the night continued, plates were served, compliments were given, the restaurant maintained its reputation, yet the earlier moment refused to fade. It lingered in the pauses, in the quieter tone of voices, in the way staff now looked twice before making assumptions. And as the final seating began to wind down, Brooks stepped away from the kitchen, moving toward the front of the house, his eyes scanning the room not with authority, but with a new awareness, as if he were seeing it for the first time. He stopped near the table where Emily had been seated, the chair now empty. The space returned to its original state, yet it held a presence that could not be erased. He rested his hand lightly on the back of the chair. For a moment, not out of habit, but out of recognition, and then he let it go, straightening slightly as he turned away, because the lesson had already been delivered, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. And as the last guests prepared to leave, and the lights dimmed slightly, the restaurant stood as it always had, elegant, controlled, precise. But now, beneath that surface, there was something else, something quieter, something more grounded, a reminder that excellence does not need to announce itself, and that sometimes, the most important shifts happen not in the spotlight, but in the silence that follows, leaving behind a space where respect is no longer assumed, but understood. By the time the last guest stepped out into the cool Manhattan night, the glow of the chandeliers dimmed slightly, casting longer shadows across the marble floor, and inside Brooks and Stone, the rhythm of the evening finally began to slow. Plates cleared, chairs adjusted, the quiet work of closing settling into place. But the silence that followed was not the same as any other night, because something had been left behind, something that could not be reset with routine. Chef Daniel Brooks stood alone near the pass for a moment, his hands resting lightly on the polished surface, his reflection faintly visible in the steel. And for the first time in years, he was not thinking about ratings, not thinking about critics, not thinking about the next innovation or the next recognition. He was thinking about a woman who had walked into his restaurant unnoticed and walked out leaving everything changed without ever asking for attention. One of the senior sous chefs approached quietly, removing his apron, hesitating before speaking. "Chef," he said, his tone careful, "we closed strong tonight." And Brooks nodded slowly, though the words seemed distant. "We always do," he replied. But there was no pride in it, only acknowledgement. The sous chef lingered for a second, then added, "That dish earlier. I have never seen anything like it." And this time Brooks did not respond immediately, his gaze lowering slightly as he replayed the moment again. The precision, the restraint, the confidence without display. And then he spoke, his voice quieter than before. "Neither have I." And the admission carried weight, not as a failure, but as recognition, because excellence had stood in front of him, unannounced, and he had almost missed it entirely. Across the room, the staff continued their closing tasks. But the conversations were different now. softer, more thoughtful. One of the younger cooks spoke under his breath. She did not even try to impress anyone. And another replied, she did not have to. And those words settled into the room like a quiet truth. Simple and undeniable, Brooks stepped away from the pass, moving slowly through the kitchen. One last time, his eyes tracing the familiar layout, but seeing it with a clarity that had not been there before. The stations, the tools, the structure, all of it built on discipline, but also on assumption, and that realization lingered as he reached the door leading to the dining room. Pausing briefly before stepping through, the chairs were now empty. The table where Emily had sat cleared and reset, ready for the next day as if nothing had happened, but the space still held a presence, not visible, not tangible, yet undeniable. He approached it once more, stopping just short of the chair, his hand hovering for a brief second before dropping back to his side, because there was nothing left to hold on to, only something to carry forward. Outside, through the glass, the city moved as it always did, taxis passing, people walking, life continuing without pause. And somewhere in that movement, Emily Carter had already disappeared again, just as quietly as she had arrived, leaving behind no trace except the impact she had made. And inside the restaurant, the final lights dimmed further, the staff beginning to leave one by one, their voices low, their expressions thoughtful, as if each of them carried a piece of the lesson with them. Brooks remained a moment longer, standing in the quiet that now felt different, not empty, but full. And as he finally turned to leave, switching off the last of the kitchen lights, the reflection of the room faded into darkness, leaving behind a space that looked the same, yet would never be seen the same way again. Because once a moment like that happens, once the truth of it settles in, it does not disappear, it stays, reshaping the way everything is understood, long after the doors have closed. The next morning arrived quietly, the city already awake before the sun fully cleared the skyline. And inside Brooks and Stone, the early light filtered through the tall windows, softer now, less dramatic than the glow of the night before, revealing a space that looked unchanged, yet carried something beneath the surface that could not be reset. Chef Daniel Brooks stood alone in the kitchen before the staff arrived, his jacket freshly pressed, his posture composed, but his focus different, his eyes moving across the stations not as a ruler surveying control, but as someone reconsidering what control truly meant. He walked slowly to the halibut station, pausing in front of it, the same ingredients laid out as they had been the night before, butter, saffron, citrus, all measured, all ready, yet something about them felt incomplete, not because they were lacking, but because he now understood that precision alone was not what had defined what he had witnessed. He reached for the knife, holding it briefly before setting it back down again, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition. The difference between skill and mastery was not in the tools, it was in the intent behind them. The door behind him opened softly as the first of the staff began to arrive, their voices low, their movements respectful, as if the memory of the previous night had followed them into the morning. One of the younger cooks approached his station, glancing toward Brooks for direction, but instead of immediate correction or instruction, Brooks simply nodded once, allowing him to begin. And that small moment did not go unnoticed, because it was not how things had been before. As the rest of the team filtered in, the kitchen slowly came to life, but the tone remained different, quieter, more aware, not driven by fear of mistake, but guided by something more deliberate, more thoughtful. And as service preparations began, Brooks gathered the team briefly, his presence still commanding, but his voice measured. Yesterday, he began, pausing just long enough for the room to settle. We were reminded of something important. He did not elaborate immediately, allowing the silence to hold the weight of the statement. Skill is expected here, he continued, but respect is not optional. And the words, simple as they were, carried a clarity that required no further explanation. The staff listened without interruption, because they understood, not just the message, but the moment that had shaped it. Brooks looked around the room, meeting their eyes one by one, not asserting authority, but acknowledging accountability. And then he stepped back, allowing them to return to their work. The day moved forward, orders were prepared, dishes were refined, the rhythm of excellence continuing. Yet beneath it all, There was a shift that could be felt in the smallest details, the way a cook paused before assuming, the way a server approached a table without judgment, the way the kitchen itself seemed to breathe differently. And outside, the city carried on, unaware of the quiet transformation that had taken place within those walls. Somewhere beyond the restaurant, Emily Carter walked through the morning crowd, just another face among many, her steps unhurried, her presence unchanged, because she had not come to change anything. She had simply been herself, and that had been enough. Back inside Brooks and Stone, the first guests of the day began to arrive, unaware of what had happened before them, taking their seats, trusting the experience they had come for. And as the kitchen delivered each plate with precision and care, something unseen moved with it, something that had not been there before, a quiet understanding, a reminder carried in every detail. And as the camera of the moment pulls back from the room, from the polished surfaces and the measured movements, from the chef who now sees differently and the team that works with a deeper awareness, one truth remains, steady and unspoken. That respect is not earned by appearance, not granted by status, but revealed through humility. And on that day, in that quiet kitchen, the world remembered what dignity looks like.